This week we starting the second book of the 5 books of Moses called Shemot or Exodus, and the first parsha of this book is called Shemot. Shemot means names. And first, as usual, the content of this parsha. 70 souls came to Egypt when Pharaoh invited Yaakov and all his families to live in Egypt, since his first minister, second in command, was Joseph, Jacob's son. We learned all of that in the previous parsha. So the 70 souls consisted of the 12 tribes, which were tribes of Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, and then Joseph and his 2 sons, actually, Manasseh and Ephraim, which formed the 2 other tribes, the 11th and 12th. They settled in Goshen, as we discussed last week, and they multiplied incredibly. Threatened by their growing numbers, Pharaoh got afraid of them. And it was a purely political decision, basically, to enslave the Jews. So he enslaves them and orders the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill the male babies at birth, because he was told that the Redeemer of the Jewish people will come very soon, and it will be a male baby, and it will be basically killed in water. So when Shiphrah and Puah do not comply, he commands his people to cast Hebrew and as well as Egyptian male babies into the Nile, which is genocide. Now, on Adar 7th of the year 2368, Yocheved, the daughter of Levi and the wife of Amram, gave birth to a son who would later be named Moses. The Egyptian astrologers saw that the Jews' Redeemer had indeed been born already, and he would meet his end in the water. And this is why all of this was transpiring. When Yocheved realized that the baby is getting, he was born actually after 6 months of pregnancy. So she managed to keep him with her for 3 months. And then he realized that the Egyptians will come over and check on her because they saw her being pregnant. So she placed the baby in a basket and put the basket in the river Nile. And while baby's sister Miriam was standing watch from afar, looking at this basket. It happened so that Pharaoh's daughter Batia went bathing in the Nile, and she saw the basket and she discovers the boy, and she decides to adopt him. The baby didn't want to feed from the Egyptian women, and this is when Miriam offers Batia to arrange for a Jewish woman to help Batia to feed the child. And naturally she went to her mother, Yocheved, which was mother of Moses, and arranged her to become the nursing maid for Batia. So not only Yocheved was nursing her own son, but she was paid for it as well, which was a God's miracle, definitely. Batia raised her adopted son as her son and names him Moses. However, Moses stayed with Yahweh for 12 years, so he knew very well who he is. He knew his Jewish origins very well. And then he was transferred after the age of 12. He was transferred to the palace. Batia took over, and eventually he became one of the major administrators in Pharaoh's palace structure. At the age of approximately 20, as a young man, Moses left the palace and discovered the hardships of his brethren. He sees the Egyptian, one day he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew man, and he kills the Egyptian. The next day, he saw other two Jewish men basically fighting. And when he went to them and told them, why are you fighting? What are you doing? They replied that we saw what you did to the Egyptian the other day. And Moses got petrified. And obviously he was forced to flee from Egypt immediately. In Midrash you will find that he actually fled to Cush, Ethiopia, where he joined the army of King Kinkas, who was basically laid siege to his own capital, because while he was fighting somewhere outside the capital, the people inside the capital decided to take over. It was Balaam. We will hear about him in the future. So he was forced to lay siege for 9 years. Eventually the king Kinkas actually died, never took over the capital. And the army officers respected Moses so much for many aspects, which I don't have the time to explain all of this. They offered him to become their king, because the son of Kinkas was far too young, was a baby, right? And Moses was a king of Ethiopia for 40 years. In the year 2434, at the age of 67, Moses left Ethiopia. Yes, he was given lots of gifts, because he simply passed on the kingship of Ethiopia to the son of King Kinkas. So his retirement plan, his retrenchment package was huge. He was a very wealthy man. So he left Ethiopia and settled in the land of Midian. He thought that it was time to get married. At the age of 67, yeah, it's a good time to get married. So he sat down near the well, exactly the same way as Jacob did it before him, and he decided he will find a wife at the well. And guess what happens? He rescues Jethro's daughters. Jethro was a priest of Midian, and he marries Jethro's daughter Zipporah, and he becomes a shepherd for his father-in-law. He shepherds his flocks. And then one day, God appears to Moses in a burning bush at the foot of Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, and instructs him to go to Pharaoh and demand, let my people go, so that they may serve me, God. Moses has a discussion with Hashem, with God, and refuses actually 4 times, but eventually he realizes that God has made up his mind, and there is no discussion further. Moses' brother Aaron appointed to serve as his spokesman. And in Egypt, Moses and Aaron assemble all the elders of Israel and tell them that the time of the redemption has arrived, has come. The people believe them, but the problem is that Pharaoh refuses to let them go. And even more so, he intensifies the suffering. He no longer provides for them the straw for the bricks which they must make, which was pure, slave labor in there taking place. Not that much for building the storehouses of Pitom and Ramses, but simply to keep Jews really, really working hard. That was the idea. Moses returns to God with a protest, and he says to him the following words: "Why have you done evil to these people?" At which God eventually promised him that the redemption is very close at hand. And that's the content of the whole parsha. Now, I didn't know about the events which took place actually today. Today is Thursday, the 7th of January, and in the United States it's the 6th of January. And there was a huge event of civil disobedience. But I prepared this, quite a few days prior to that. Why I felt that it's important to talk about the question of civil disobedience? It's because there was a lot of civil disobedience during the 2020. So let's look at the whole aspect of what is civil disobedience and how we should look at it from Torah perspective. And it actually comes up in this parsha in a very strong way. Rabbi Sachs writes in the opening chapters of Exodus. Exodus plunges us into the midst of epic events. In a short time, Israelites were transformed from protected minority in Goshen, which they were protected in there and treated very nicely initially, to slaves. Moses passes from prince of Egypt to Midianite shepherd, and then becomes the leader of the Israelites. Yeah, he went through the whole story of being the king of Cush as well. And then he has this history-changing encounter at the burning bush, at which God tells him of his purpose in life to lead Jewish people to the promised land. But there is one small episode that deserves to be seen as a turning point in history of humanity. Two ladies, Shifra and Puah, they are remarkable women, which they were told by Pharaoh, none less than the Pharaoh himself, the king, that they must kill all male babies born when they taking delivery from Jewish women of the babies when they arrive. And Pharaoh says to them the following: when you are helping the Hebrew women during the childbirth on delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. That's genocide. That's a horrible, horrible order. The interesting part of it, that the Hebrew description of the two women sounds like this: Hamayaldot ha-ivriot. And it's very ambiguous description. It could mean the Hebrew midwives, which is a classical explanation and says that basically Yocheved and Miriam were those midwives. Well, but there is another one, because it says the midwives to the Hebrews. That's another translation of this phrase, Hamayaldot ha-ivriot. And in which case they could be Egyptian women. Now, obviously there are differences of opinion amongst the sages, because the Josephus Abravanel and Samuel David Luzzatto believe that Hebrew women like Yocheved and Miriam could not be those women, because asking them to commit genocide and to kill Jewish babies was basically illogical. They will never do that. So Pharaoh is not stupid. So there is a high probability they were really Egyptian women who committed the very first act of civil disobedience. What they did, they refused to carry out that order. The Torah says very clearly about it. The Torah says the midwives, however, had feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. So they let the boys live. Their explanation to the Pharaoh was very interesting. They said to the Pharaoh, we couldn't do it, because Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. At which Pharaoh did not have an answer to that. So the entire incident reminds us of one of the most incredible findings about the courage of those two women who saved Jewish babies. And the parallel of that is to those non-Jewish people around the world who during the Holocaust have saved Jewish lives. They were all sorts of people, different countries, different places, different people, but what was common with all of them is the fact that they saw nothing remarkable in what they did. Often the mark of real heroes is that they do not see themselves as heroes. When they were asked, why did you do it? You risked your own life with that. What the answer was, because that is what a human being is supposed to do. And that is probably the meaning of the statement that they feared God. It is the Torah's generic description of those who have a moral sense, a strong, natural sense of morality. The reality is that in our civilization, it took more than 3,000 years for what the midwives did to become enshrined in international law. And it took place in 1946 at the Nazi war criminal Nuremberg trial. And when the Nazis who were on trial offered as defense that they were merely obeying orders of their superiors, given the duly constituted, democratically elected government, which Hitler was democratically elected, there was a requirement to make a new legal concept, namely a crime against humanity, to establish the guilt of the architects and the administrators of the genocide. The Nuremberg principle gave legal substance to what the midwives instinctively understood, that there are orders that should not be obeyed because they are immoral. Moral law transcends and may override the law of the state. Talmud puts it this way. It says, if there is a conflict between the words of the master, meaning God, and the words of the disciple, meaning human being, the words of the master must prevail. The Nuremberg trials were not the first occasion on which the story of midwives had a significant impact on the history of humanity. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church has forbidden translating the Torah, the Bible, basically, into common languages which could be understood by everybody. Because knowledge is power, and therefore they kept the Bible knowledge in their hands, in the hands of priesthood. In the course of 16th century, Three developments took place and changed the whole equation on this. First was the Reformation, which with placing the Bible into the center stage of religious life. And then the second was the invention of the printing press. As a matter of fact, Lutherans were convinced that this was a divine providence, the invention of the printing press. God has sent the printing press to us so that the doctrines of the Reformed Church could be spread worldwide. That's what they were saying. Third was the fact that some people, regardless of the ban, have translated the Bible anyway. And now, able to read the Bible by themselves for the first time, people soon discovered that it was, as far as monarchy is concerned, a highly dangerous document. Because it tells how God told Samuel that in seeking to appoint a king, the Israelites were rejecting him as their only sovereign. Or it describes graphically how the prophets were actually arguing and debating with the kings. And they challenging kings because they were saying, we represent the authority of God himself. And then obviously the Bible is telling the story of those two midwives who refused to carry out Pharaoh's orders. Even God himself can be called to account in the name of the justice. We have got in the Torah, we learning that Abraham debates with God, the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. King James understood clearly the dire implications of the whole story, that eventually he will be unable to stop the spread of the Bible, and he commissioned his own translation of the Bible, and which appeared in the public in year 1611. Throughout the 17th century, by far the most influential force in English politics was the Hebrew Bible. And as understood by Puritans, the Puritans traveled from England to what eventually will become United States. Majority of them had the King James Bible on their armpit. And that's the fact. In the end, though, it was the courage of two remarkable women that created the precedent later taken up and in turn inspired people like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King in 20th century. During 2020, we had numerous acts of civil disobedience around the world. The anti-lockdown demonstrations, refusal to wear masks demonstrations and protests, Black Lives Matter protests, anti-government protests in Lebanon, and much, much more. And obviously today the protests and events which took place at Capitol Hill in the United States. The question is, do all of them carry the same moral foundation as a protest against immorality of the authorities? In other words, are all of those protests morally justified or not? Let's try to look at them very quickly. All anti-lockdown protests and refusal to wear face masks protests around the world are by their definition basically immoral. Since nobody has the right to infect other people with COVID-19 or any other disease. And we all know very well that wearing the masks, we are not protecting only ourselves, but we're protecting other people in case we are sick. So all of these protests are not morally justified and as such should not take place. They are bordering on anarchy. Let's look at the Black Lives Matter protests. They are protests which showing opposition to racism worldwide. They oppose police brutality, and as such do carry the justification of moral civil disobedience protest. They started because of George Floyd, African American, who was killed by police on the 25th of May 2020. However, there are some problems with all of this. First of all, George Floyd was not a hero and an angel. He was a violent criminal threatening to kill a pregnant woman. And that is supported right through the whole internet. The other problem is with those protests that majority of those protests were associated with brutal riots, destruction of businesses and property, and brutal reverse racial behavior against white people. For example, forcing white women to stand on their knees in the middle of the street and apologize to African American men towering over them, basically exhuming power, physical, brutal force. This is not civil disobedience. It's an open racial discrimination. 100% criminal and totally immoral behavior. So by doing this, these people basically discredited the whole movement of Black Lives Matter. On the other hand, the anti-government protests in Lebanon are 100% morally justified, since they are acts of civil disobedience to government corruption, facilitated by Hezbollah terrorist organization interests, which led to numerous deaths and injuries of thousands of people due to the explosion of bomb-making chemicals at Beirut wharves. Now, Shifra and Puah are two of the great heroines of Torah. The first to teach humanity the moral limits of power. But humanity should be very, very careful with using the concept of civil disobedience, since without proper moral compass, it can lead to either anarchy or dictatorship. And that is the most fundamental issue today in the world, and of course, most of all, in United States of America. Shabbat Shalom.
למען החי